Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today, which is on the overview of the consent policy for provider access to the Vermont Health Information Exchange. I'm Steve LaRose. I'm VITL's Vice President for Marketing, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Joining me is Ann Kramer, VITL's attorney and also a partner in the firm of Primer, Piper, Eggleston, and Kramer. Before we begin, I want to just let you know that the slides and a recording of today's webinar will be posted this afternoon, later on this afternoon, at www.vitl.net/media. So what we're going to do is Ann is going to give we're going to go through about a 40-minute presentation. Ann will speak first, and then I will give you a little bit of some information about the how we're implementing the consent policy. And then basically, beyond that, we will take your questions. I'm getting some background noise, so I'm going to have to make some adjustments here for a sec, if you wouldn't mind bearing with me. I think that hopefully that took care of it. So, and as I said, we'll go through a presentation, and then we will take your questions. Now, we do anticipate that there will be quite a few questions, and so we will try to answer as many of them as possible in today's webinar. We will also, if there are enough questions, we'll try to stay on past 1 o'clock in order to answer as many questions as we can. So with those sort of introductories out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Ann, and Ann, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As Steve has said, the purpose today is to focus on the consent policy for provider access to information that is available on the Vermont Health Information Exchange. Just a little bit of background before I talk about the policy itself is that what we're looking at, the consent policy applies to situations where we have participating providers who have contracted with VITL. So that's the first step, is that a provider organization, and when I talk about participating providers, I'm really talking about the whole organization, not just an individual physician or other individual provider. So that when the organization contracts with VITL to make information that they have in their medical record available to the VHI, the Vermont Health Information Exchange, under terms of the services agreement. As part of this agreement and as part of the HITECH Act, VITL as an exchange operator is authorized by law to act as the business associate for each provider organization who contracts with it, and also to be what we call a qualified services organization of participating providers in the event that the provider is a substance abuse treatment center. So once there's a contract in place, at that point in time, the consent policy becomes effective. And the purpose of the policy, just a general overview, is that it details the patient consent requirements for the provider organization and individual providers within that organization to access patient data on the Vermont Health Information Exchange. It contains a definition section, it talks about the form of the consent, and it also explains situations where information may be accessed for emergency access. And so we'll dive into these areas as we go through the overview today. A little background on the policy itself. The state of Vermont is authorized really by law and as part of the Health Information Technology Plan to establish the policies that govern the exchange. Our DEVA, the Department of Vermont Health Access, had over really what turned out to be a 2-year period convened a stakeholder group to work on the policy, to look at what other states were doing, and the draft that emerged from that work group was approved basically this fall by the Secretary of Administration and the Green Mountain Care Board. So once the policy is adopted, it's VITL's job to implement that to have an implementation plan and to begin outreach as it embarks upon signing up participating providers for the Vermont Health Information Exchange. Now, for providers to access data on the exchange, they may only access data for patients with written consent on file. That's our basic premise for the consent policy and in compliance with both Vermont and federal law. The policy, and it's important for people to understand this, it does not apply outside of the VHI. So if data is being accessed on the VHI, but it happens to be the provider's own data, the policy is not applicable because there may be situations where the participating provider is working with VITL to look at its own information, or if it's a situation where the provider is directly sending or receiving information on a one-on-one relationship with another provider, and it may be through VITL, but there's either a connectivity agreement or direct referral, this policy does not apply to it. This policy is intended for where information is generally available for treatment purposes for participating providers. Now, the consent policy basically requires that each participating provider, and again I'm talking about the organization, shall seek written consent from patients for access to their PHI on the exchange. And this is a one-time access or one-time consent that then allows access as long as that individual is in a treating relationship. The consent form must have certain language, which we're going to review, and then the provider needs to have the record of that consent, either electronically or in a hard copy written form, whatever works. And I don't know, my screen's just up. Well, my screen has just shut down, so Steve's going to come over here and help, and I'll keep talking. So the provider has an obligation to keep record of consent on an ongoing basis so long as it's a participating provider. Now, the consent form, and we're going to talk forward and the slides will catch up here. The consent form can be a form that either the provider has incorporated into its forms and it matches the requirements of the policy, or VITL will supply a model consent form. So either way, but what the form will need to do is it will need to have a date, not name, address, birth date of the individual who's consenting. It will be effective indefinitely as long as the individual is the provider's patient, unless the provider organization wishes to have an expiration date that is different, and that's the choice of the provider organization, or unless the consent is revoked, and we'll talk about revocation after we get through these explanatory steps. The consent may be provided by the individual or by the individual's authorized legal representative. There are 6 statements that need to be in the consent form. First, that the patient consents to the provider's access, use, or disclosure of PHI, including mental health and substance abuse treatment information on the VHI on the Vermont Health Information Exchange for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. That's the first and critical statement. The consent also will state that it includes a consent for the redisclosure of PHI received from a drug or alcohol treatment program, so that if one of the treatment programs is participating on the VHI and their information is available, that information is consented for a redisclosure. The third requirement is that the consent acknowledges that the patient has been referred to VITL for information on the exchange and has been also made aware of the provider's notice of privacy practices. Additionally, the fourth requirement is that the consent form acknowledge that there is no need to consent to access on the VHI in order to receive treatment from the provider, so that this is not, this is, at least as part of state policy, not a requirement that treatment would be conditioned on consenting to exchange access. The fifth statement is that consent may be revoked at any time, with the acknowledgement and the exception that if the PHI was already obtained, that you can't pull that back, obviously. And then lastly, that the consent will terminate when the patient no longer sees the provider for care. So this is intended to be patients that are active in a provider organization, and they're, more or less, this establishes a expiration date so that if somebody moves away or otherwise notifies a provider that they will no longer be following up with them, that consent would terminate. Now, looking at the patient education materials that VITL is going to be making available, they will be, once you're a participating provider, you will be basically receiving materials or information on accessing the materials. Patients shall also be advised of the availability of your notice of privacy practices. Now, this, for all of you who are thinking about complying with the new high-tech rule, we've just noted here that it is an opportunity and a requirement now that you will be updating those notice of privacy practices between now and September 23rd, when those rules become effective. And we can talk about that at a different point in time. Moving forward, the individual may also have access to their information on the exchange. And so this is important for providers and individuals to be aware of this, that the individual has a right to request to see his or her data available on the exchange. This request can be made either through the participating provider or through VITL. The access can be electronic, but it does not have to be. It can, information can be printed out for the individual. Now, another important aspect of the policy is that it does provide for emergency access. And basically, the participating provider, where we have a situation that an individual is experiencing a medical emergency and is not able to consent to the providers accessing their information on the exchange, where in fact there is a medical emergency, the participating provider can enter into the exchange and note that this is a break the glass or emergency access, and be able to obtain or view information in that event. Within each organization, you may be setting some role-based security as to who has that power. That will be up to each organization, but there is this opportunity for emergency consent. It is only to be used during the treatment of the emergency medical condition, and then following the emergency, either the individual or the legal representative would be notified that information about them on the exchange has been accessed. Now, Following that emergency access, if the provider wants to have further access to the individual's information on the exchange, at that time they would obtain written consent either from the individual or their authorized legal representative. The last note here is that if there is data from a substance abuse treatment program that was accessed in the emergency, the provider who supplied the data, that substance abuse treatment program, will be notified of the access. And so that this is to set up and comply with the rules in the Federal Register for substance abuse treatment related medical information. Now, part of the policy also requires that VITL periodically audit provider record of consent. And so from time to time, VITL will be requesting to have and to review whether or not the accesses or a sample of accesses from a provider actually do reflect patients from whom they've received consent. And so this is one of those just simply to make sure both your organization and VITL is running the exchange according to both law and according to the participation agreements that will be signed. There's a separate policy on auditing and monitoring that is in the process of being updated to match the consent policy that VITL will be following. And this will also require that VITL shall review all instances of emergency access to PHI on the exchange, so that if a participating provider entered the exchange through a what will be called break the glass event for an treating of emergency medical condition, that will trigger VITL to take a look and make sure that that was appropriate. An individual may request from VITL an audit report of access to his or her information on the exchange. VITL will is basically, will reply to those as soon as reasonably possible and within a 30 calendar day period. Now, the individual may revoke consent to access data on the exchange at any time. Once a notice of revocation is received, the participating provider shall not access the exchange to seek that individual's PHI. This will, the data more or less will not be accessible to that organization for that individual, so that there will be basically a latch on that information to the organization if a revocation was received. Now, in the event that there is PHI from a federal substance abuse treatment program under the federal rules that is accessed on the exchange, the VHI shall provide notification with that information about the source of that information. So there is a required text that is set forth in the federal rules. Presently, VITL does not have the mechanism to accomplish that notification, but that is in process, as this is an aspect of any exchange that wants to be able to have information accessed from all providers, including federal substance abuse treatment programs. And so hopefully that will be up and coming shortly. When there is this access, the actual text, and we've got a quick slide that summarizes this, and you can understand a little bit what the challenge is. The actual notice of prohibition of redisclosure is quite lengthy, and so the text of the notice that needs to be attached to that data includes these 4 statements: that it's been disclosed to you by a that the records protected by the federal rules prohibit you from making any further disclosure unless it's expressly permitted by a written consent by the individual, which we've tried to anticipate. A general authorization is not sufficient, and the federal rules will restrict the use of that information to even criminal investigation or prosecution. So it's a lengthy notice of prohibition, and that will get tagged to data in the event that we are transferring information from federal substance abuse treatment facilities. Now I'm going to put Steve back on so that he can talk with you further about the practical workflow aspect of the consent policy, and then we'll be able to take questions after his presentation.
Okay, Ann, well, great. Thank you very much for going through that, and we really appreciate the explanation of the various aspects of the policy. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how we're going to implement the policy. And we're going to do that through a new service that we call VITL Access. And I'll take a few minutes to explain a little bit more about that. So the providers will be the ones who are asking for consent from their patients. It will not be VITL. The providers have the relationship with the patients, and so it really is best that they ask for the consent because they have that trusted relationship. The patients know who the providers are. And this will happen, we expect that most of the time this consent request will happen at the registration desk. And it could be as simple as just one sentence, as you see here. It can also be part of the process that providers use to get consent for using the protected health information for treatment, payment, healthcare operations, what I think we commonly call HIPAA consent. Although Angie's cringing at that. Is that not the exact word?
Well, it's really a consent under Vermont law to be able to use the information for what is allowed under HIPAA, which is treatment, payment, and healthcare operations.
Okay, thanks for setting me straight there. So once the question has been posed to the patient, there'll be a couple of potential responses. One, it would be yes, I definitely would like to give you consent. And so the patient would be given a consent form to sign. If they're unsure or if they would rather not give consent, and this is completely voluntary, then the staff could answer any questions that the patient may have, or they would give them a brochure that has a toll-free number in it that would ring here at VITL, and that we would answer any questions that the patient has. Now, as far as what happens when the patient processes or when the patient gives consent, there has to be some processing done of the forms. And the providers can scan that signed consent form into their EHR and set up a tracking system so they know who has given consent and who has not. We very much will encourage the providers who are participating in this to do that, but it's not necessarily a requirement, but we think it's a very good step. I mean, as Ann has just explained, there is a requirement that you have to keep, if you're a provider and you've gotten consent, you have to keep some sort of record that you've gotten the consent, either the actual form or the image of the form, so that if there is a question or if during a audit the provider has that documentation that the consent was received. Now, the other thing that we'll be doing is that we do realize that this could produce some administrative burden, having to do all of this processing. So we're going to try to relieve as much of that administrative burden as possible by VITL doing the back office functions, and that is what we call setting the consent flag basically enabling the software to then go ahead and to, when a query is done for that patient, to be able to, the software knows that the patient has given consent and then can go ahead and display the information to the provider who's received the consent. But we're staffing up in anticipation of doing that back office function. So when the patient has given consent and the back office work has been done, then the provider can go ahead and access the patient information through a provider portal. And I'm going to show you a few slides about what that looks like. So this will work on, you don't need special software for this. This works on a web browser, any of the major web browsers, as we have come to know and love web browsing. You can use this. It is a secure connection. So and as part of that security feature, each individual who has access and is authorized will have their own username and their own password. And as you can see in the lower right hand corner, they'll be asked to enter that and then to log on. Once they have logged in, and in this case this shows Susan Zimmerman, who's our project manager, but that would have the username up there. And then what they would do is they would enter the patient's name and any other type of search criteria, as you see here. They would see a list of results, and this is test data, by the way. As you can see by the column, it says test. So we're not exposing anybody's protected health information during this webinar. But you would see a list of results that match the criteria for your search. And then you can click on one of those results and then pull up the details, such as the lab test result, as you see here. As I mentioned, there is quite a bit of security features in this. The information is encrypted so that in transit, as it's going back and forth, it's encrypted. Same type of thing, very high level of encryption, the same type of thing as we've gotten to those of us who use online banking and other types of secure websites have been using. As I mentioned, each authorized user will have their own unique username and password. There will be an audit log to track who has accessed the information, when, who did it, what they looked at, when they looked at it. In this case, this is more secure than paper records in this regard. In that paper record, there is no log of who looked at what. Whereas in this case, the system automatically keeps track of who logged in, what they looked at, when they looked at it. And so VITL can go back and look at those audit logs if need be. And we will be routinely doing audits and monitoring for any suspicious activity. So you're probably saying, well, what will I be able to see using this provider portal? And here's a list of the different types of information that could be available in the portal. It'll vary some depending on the source of the information. Lab test results, radiology exam reports, patient demographics, discharge summaries, clinical summaries, medication histories, those sort of things. So why use this provider portal? Well, it's to fill in the gaps with your existing patient information. You probably have, if you've been treating the patient, you probably already have an electronic medical record or paper chart, and you have some information. You may have taken a medical history from the patient if they're a new patient. But there may be some gaps in that information. The patient couldn't remember, or you didn't get all of the test results and that sort of thing. So what you can do is you can use this provider portal once you've gotten the patient consent to do a search and to see if there is any information in the health information exchange that you don't already have. This may be very helpful for searching for records on new patients, somebody who's been referred to you, somebody's moved to the area and is coming to you for care. They have perhaps seen providers in other parts of the state. If they've given you consent, you could do a search to look and see what sort of care they've received in other parts of the state. And it goes probably without saying, I think pretty much all providers would agree with this statement, that more information means better care. The more information the providers have, the more information that they use when making clinical decisions results in safer care and also better coordinated care. In terms of cost, there is no cost. There's no subscription fee. There are no setup charges. We're going to be providing free training and support. And the reason is because we have funding from both the State Health IT Fund and the federal grant, both of those being provided through the Department of Vermont Health Access. So let's talk, before we start to take questions, let's talk a little bit about what the next steps are. Now that you've learned about the policy and you've also learned about how we intend to implement it, we're going to be selecting a set of pilot sites. And we're going to be doing that fairly quickly because now that we've done this webinar, we're eager to get out and to start doing the working with a set of pilot sites. So if you would like to be considered for a pilot site, I'd like to ask that you send me an email, and then right there you see my email address. And if you could send it to me as soon as possible, preferably even after this webinar is over, as soon as this webinar is over. And because what we'd like to do is we'd like to have a set of sites that have been briefed by this webinar and have said, yeah, we're interested. We'd like to know more about it. We'd like you to consider us as a pilot site. The pilot sites, by the way, do have to be in the state of Vermont. We'll make that one geographic restriction. Could be anywhere in the state of Vermont, but it has to be located in the state of Vermont. That's just because that's kind of where we're set up, at least initially, to be able to do this. Another criteria will be that all the pilot sites and actually anybody who uses this service will have to sign the Vermont Health Information Exchange Services Agreement. Some of you have already done this, so you do not have to sign it again, but anybody who wants to use this service, that services agreement will have to be signed and in place. We will provide staff training for the pilot sites. So we will come out, we will train your providers, we will train your staff, your office staff, anybody who's going to have access. We will train them on a couple of things. We'll train them on how to ask for consent, how to answer the patient questions, and then also how to use the provider portal to access the information. We'll be supplying consent forms, patient brochures, wall posters. We'll be providing all of those materials for you if you're participating in this project. And we do anticipate, as I mentioned, we're eager to get going. So we do anticipate that we'll be out working with the pilot sites in April, and that those sites that are chosen will be starting to ask for consent during the month of April. And I think that is it for my part of this as far as talking about what we're going to do to implement. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to have you do one of two things if you have a question. You can either type your question in the question box that's on your screen, and then that will pop up on my screen, and I see several of you have already been busy and been doing this. Those questions will pop up on my screen, and then what I'll do is I'll ask Ann or myself to answer the question. The other thing that you can do, if you want to ask your question verbally, what you can do is you can click there's a little raise your hand icon on your screen. I think it looks like a little hand. And if you want to ask your question verbally, click that little hand icon, because what that'll do is that'll signal to me that you have, either on the phone or if you're listening to us on the internet, you have like a headset. And then that will tell me that instead of the typing it in the box, that you prefer to just talk to us, and we'll open your line, unmute your line, and I'll give you a little bit of advance notice when I'm doing that. I'll call on you, so to speak, so you'll be aware that I'm opening your line. So here we go, and Ann's got her headset on, and so she's ready. So we've got a lot of questions. So Tony, I'm going to take one of yours since you were the first guy off the block here. I'm going to take one of yours that so the question, Ann, is Tony is saying, it is my understanding that many health information exchanges do not require written consent for access and include it in their own HIPAA agreements. Is this true? And if so, is there an expressed rationale for this? So did you understand the question?
I think so. What our problem is, and the distinction in Vermont, is that every state has different law. So one of the decisions that was made when HIPAA was passed was not to require a set of basically a set of rules for the states, and simply allow each state that if they had a stricter law on patient privacy, that law would overrule HIPAA. So unfortunately, states like Vermont, which do have a stricter law, and our stricter law is the patient privilege, which is found in Title 12, which more or less restricts the release of information unless a patient has either consented or unless it's required by law. So for that is the reason that we seek consent from the individual patients for a provider to access information that is available on the exchange, and VITL is able to have it on the exchange because it's a business associate of each participating provider, but it may not allow access without that patient consent. The exception is emergencies, because in that instance there is a legal theory that supports implied consent, that if you are in need of emergency treatment, that you would consent appropriately to have information available. So unless either Vermont requires that that information be available to all providers, which Vermont has not done for an exchange, or the federal government were to change its laws to require states to have information available to any exchange, that is why we need to go through the consent process.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ann. So I'm going to try to, as long as there are people who have raised their hands, I'm going to try to alternate back and forth a little bit between the written questions and the audio questions. So let's give this a try. I'm going to go to Tracy, and I'm going to hopefully unmute Tracy's line. Tracy, go ahead with your question. Tracy Richardson? Well, maybe not. Let me try somebody else. I'm going to try Susan Sullivan. Susan, can you hear me and can you ask your question? Not having a whole lot of luck with the audio on that regard. All right, so let's keep going with the written questions then. Here's a good one from Lee, and this one I don't think that this is a good question. I don't think I've been asked this question yet. It is, will an existing patient consent still be in force if a provider seeing that patient moves to a new practice or joins a different provider organization?
That's a good question. And in this instance, the answer would be no, because the patient is being viewed as the patient of each practice organization. So the if I go, for instance, to Fletcher Allen Healthcare and consent there for access to the VHI, the providers there have access and permission to access Ann Kramer's information. If one of those physicians then is seeing me perhaps at another hospital, and they are seeing me as that hospital's employee or medical staff, in that instance, then I need to sign another consent for that organization. So the consent really goes to the organization, not to each individual physician.
Okay, thanks, Ann. So here's another question, a good question. There's a lot of good questions here. This question is, will this consent apply to DocSite? Now, for those of you who are not in the Vermont Blueprint to Health, Vermont Blueprint for Health initiative, you may not know what DocSite is, but DocSite is kind of the brand name of the registry, the clinical registry that the participants in the Vermont Blueprint for Health use. So the question is, will this consent apply to that Blueprint registry, or will the providers find themselves needing to access both systems in order to get a complete picture of an individual's status? So I'm going to go ahead and try to answer this one, but Ann, feel free to jump in here. It will not apply immediately. Let me back up. This policy is a state of Vermont policy. The state of Vermont is the one that decided the policy. VITL's role is to implement the policy. The state of Vermont has issued a memo which says that they intend this policy to also apply to the Vermont Blueprint for Health initiative. So we are working on a project to be able to take the consent and to transfer that data, meaning just the fact that the patient has consented, transfer that data so that the DocSite system understands that as well, that the patient has given that consent. And then in the DocSite system, that will enable data to be shared within the DocSite system. But that is not in place at the moment. That's coming down the road. So it's a long answer, but the short answer is that yes, the state's intention is that this policy will be for both the Health Information Exchange and then also for the participants in the Blueprint for Health project. Anything to add on that, Ann?
No, I think that's what my understanding is as well, is that there is a goal to coordinate the policy and the consents for both the DocSite participation as well as accessing information on the exchange.
So you get the consent once, it gets sent to VITL, we do our thing to enable the information to be seen in the Health Information Exchange, but then when we have that connection to the DocSite registry set up, we'll pass that patient consent information, just the fact that the patient has given consent, we'll pass that over to the DocSite system so that in the future it will enable sharing of information within the DocSite system as well. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit on my screen here and go to a question from John Aislinn. And John says, I'm just reading his question. John's question is about the workflow of the checking the health information exchange for each and every patient. So John, you've got a very lengthy question here, and probably what I'll do is I'll take that under, I'd like to take that under advisement and get back to you on that. I think I think I'm going to have to think about your question rather than just answer it off the cuff. Several people have asked about slides, and they may have joined us in the very beginning. I mentioned that we will put the slides and a recording of the webinar up later this afternoon at www.vitl.net/media. So we won't be emailing it out, but what you will be able to do is you'll be able to go to that address and you'll be able to download the slides. So here's a question. Would we have access to only our own patients or all Vermont patients? Conversely, will all statewide providers have access to our patients? So go ahead, Ann.
Okay. The intent here is that you, to comply with both the agreement that your organization is going to be signing as well as the policy, that you will only be accessing when you have consent because you are treating a patient or it's an emergency and you are treating the patient. So when you ask about only access to our patients, it's a patient that you have some treatment relationship with. Now, once you have consent to access, or if it's an emergency situation, you will have access to information of the other providers around the state who have also treated that individual. But you need to have a treating relationship to access the VHI on an individual. So and this is part of the reason that VITL will audit consents from time to time to make sure that there isn't a rogue user who might be accessing information for individuals that there's no treating relationship and that there's no consent or emergency.
Okay, thanks, Ann. I'm going to answer Joanne's question, and that is, can you be a beta site if you are not currently connected to the Health Information Exchange? And the answer is yes, absolutely. That is probably one of the most important benefits of using the provider portal, is that it will allow you to access the information that is on the Health Information Exchange through just a standard encrypted internet connection, through a web browser, rather than having to be connected and having your EHR connected to the Health Information Exchange. So yes, Joanne, beta sites. Well, she said beta sites, but we're actually calling them pilot sites. You can, even if you have a paper chart, or if you have an EHR that is not connected yet to the Health Information Exchange, or if you have an EHR that is connected to the exchange, but you may not be getting certain types of data yet through your EHR. In any of those cases, you are welcome to let me know if you want to be considered to be a pilot site. Let's see, so going back to a question. If a patient initially declines to take part in this during one admission, so somebody has been asked to for consent, but they've said, no, I'd rather not. The question is, do the registrars or the people at the front desk, do they continue offering this service during each subsequent admission in case the patient has changed their mind? Well, Shannon, that is entirely up to the practice. They can ask multiple times, or they can just, if the patient has said no, they can just stop at that one time. It's really up to the individual practice that's participating. I guess my advice would be not to bug the patient, not to ask it every time. Maybe I would say my counsel would be, if they've asked once, you could maybe have it kind of in a tickler file to ask them again, either the next time they come in, or say 3 months later or 6 months later or something like that. But I wouldn't think that you'd want to ask them each and every time, because they're probably just going to get sick of being asked the question.
Yeah. There may be situations where one of the providers might be talking with the patient to say, you're also seeing another practice. It would help us coordinate care if you consented to our accessing your information on the VHI and as well as the other practice. So there might be times where you're able to give a specific situation where it would be to the patient's direct benefit to provide consent, which they might understand in a later encounter than in one of the first initial requests.
Okay. And we will, as I mentioned earlier, we will be providing educational materials. So it's entirely possible, especially since this is fairly new for Vermont, it's entirely possible that somebody initially will say no, and then they may take the brochure, take it home, read it over, talk with their family. They may, as Ann mentioned, the providers may talk with them. They may mull it over, and then the next time they come back in, they may be willing to give consent. So it probably is good to ask somebody at some point who's declined once if they would, because quite frankly, they may very well be willing to, once they've had a chance to think about it, to talk with friends and family and what have you. I'm going to go to a question from Mary Lou, who wants to know, is the data available in real time to be accessed? She gives an example. A patient who is discharged from a hospital, one hospital, and then will the provider at another location have that, when will that data would be available? I don't know, Mary Lou, that there's a hard and fast answer. From my understanding, I'm not a technical person, but from my understanding, that the data is typically updated usually on about a 24-hour cycle. So chances are you might see that information come in within a day or two. But I do not think it's, in most cases, I doubt that it's going to be instantaneously available. You know, a record was updated right away. I think there is going to be a little bit of some lag time, but I don't think it's going to be a lot. I think most places will tend to update their records within a day or so. So Jenna has asked a question. She wants us to replay the section on redisclosure of substance abuse information. And Jenna, I can certainly understand that. It is certainly a kind of a tricky situation. So Ann, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that and what the situation is with the substance abuse information, and maybe talk a little bit about the kind of the logic as to why there is that prohibition against redisclosure, why the federal government says that you can access it if the patient is given consent, but you can't really send it further on. Can you talk a little bit about why?
This really goes to, you have to realize that the rules relating to substance abuse treatment information date back to the 70s, and it's the only area where the federal government developed very specific rules governing medical information. But particularly in the 70s, it was viewed as extremely a very large stigma to admit that you, or to have anybody be aware that you had obtain substance abuse treatment. And so there was a concern that if information was released to a physician who might be providing ongoing care for a patient, that then when there's a request of that physician for that physician's record, that this information would be redisclosed without the individual patient being aware that their substance abuse treatment information was being further distributed. We in 2013 have been trying to anticipate how to make substance abuse treatment information appropriately available on the exchange and comply with the federal rules about redisclosure. And so that's why the consent statement itself, the 6 requirements, has a specific statement about a consent. You are consenting to redisclosure of information. Now, the challenge for VITL and for other exchanges is that to the extent that the document, the summary document being accessed contains substance abuse treatment information, there has to be a notification that this came from a substance abuse treatment program. And because the rule has not been amended in the 70s, since the 70s, and it certainly, frankly, wasn't designed with the notion of an electronic exchange of information, there needs to be some evidence of those 4 required statements in the notice of prohibition. So that's why, that's the challenge, and the actual anticipating redisclosure, we have tried to anticipate in the patient's consent, but having that notice of redisclosure prohibition is the bigger challenge that goes with the data element.
Okay, thanks, Ann. So this, I think, is a very good question, and I'm glad that Carol, you've asked it. Is the VITL consent model consent to view or consent to share?
If you look at the required statements, the individual is consenting when they sign a consent to, and I'm just trying to find it as I'm talking here, I'm almost there, they are consenting to the provider's access, use, and or disclosure of PHI. So when you access the exchange with a patient's consent, you are frankly given permission to use that information, and when I say disclose, it's really the disclosure then has to, it's not suddenly you're authorized to disclose it to the world, but you can disclose it within the needs you have for treating that information. So that's what the limitation is. You may do more than view. You may bring that into your record and then treat it as you would other treatment information that you have in your own medical record.
Okay, and Carol, you're welcome to, if you want to type out a follow-up question, hopefully I'll be able to find it if that didn't quite answer your question. So I'm gonna answer Don's question about data that's available. I did mention this a little bit in the my portion of the presentation, but I think I'll emphasize that it's not every provider in Vermont, and it's not every type of information. There is some data from hospitals, but not every hospital, and also there is some variation. Some hospitals it might be a fairly wide range, and others it might be limited to just like lab results. Kind of depends on where that organization is as far in terms of their connectivity to the health information exchange. But when we talk to the pilot sites, we'll be able to go into more detail so that you'll know what you're we'll be able to give you a better idea as to what information is available and that you might be interested in and that might be applicable to your patient population. Well, Ann, here's another one of these questions that I don't think I've heard yet. So if you're willing for the challenge, let's give it a go. How will having access to the Health Information Exchange obligate the provider to have a thorough knowledge of all available information when it comes to risk and liability? You can say, I'll take that one under advisement if you want.
Well, the hard thing is I'm not quite sure the intent of the question on risk and liability. I mean, certainly having access to the exchange provides a provider more information. But when the provider looks at the information on the exchange and say they see a medication list, they should be reviewing with the individual, if they're competent and awake, to confirm that they are still taking the medications listed. So from a standpoint of prudent practice, you get more information, but you still need to do a little bit of work in talking with your patient as to whether or not they're following a treatment plan, just making sure that the information that you're looking at is in fact useful in your current treatment encounter. So I think there is some responsibility in looking at the information and making sure that it's appropriate for your treatment of the individual. I don't know at this point, and exchanges are relatively new. I have not seen a trend in liability or risk exposure at this point that we could talk about that has resulted from providers using exchanges.
Okay, thanks, Ann. So Rhonda, I'm going to answer your question, or at least attempt to answer your question. Rhonda asks, how will VITL determine that a patient belongs to a provider, and belongs is in quotation, belongs to a provider so that consent is not required? Well, actually consent is always going to be required, but I think what should be. And then Rhonda also asked, how will VITL know that the relationship has been terminated? Because we talked about earlier about that relationship being terminated. And the third part of Rhonda's question is, how will VITL track that consent is active or revoked? Well, Rhonda, this all goes to what I referred to as a back office function. So the flow is that the provider asks for the patient consent. The patient decides either to give consent or not, but if they do want to give consent, then they would sign a consent form. That consent form will be sent to VITL in most cases, because I think most of the practices will want us to do the back office functions rather than add to their administrative burden, and we're perfectly willing to do that.
And I'm just going to clarify at least a record of that consent, because the practice will still need to maintain its record of the consent.
Absolutely. So what you can do if you want us to do the administrative work on this is to send us that consent form once, as Van points out, you've kept a copy of it yourself. And then we'll take care of kind of turning on and turning off the consent. Now, as far as revocation, if the patient revokes their consent, well, then they have to sign a revocation form. And it's the same basic principle as we just talked about. You keep a copy for yourself so that you've got it documented that the consent was revoked. You send that form in to us, and then we take care of the back office functions of turning off the consent in our system because we've got a revocation form. As far as the termination of the relationship, that question was asked of us before, and not during this webinar, but in previous conversations. And what typically happens, correct me if I'm wrong, Ann, but what typically happens is a patient will come in and will say, I'm moving, and I'm no longer coming here for seeking care. You know, send my medical records somewhere else. They may be moving out of state, different part of the state, whatever. So it's at that point, the practice knows that the patient relationship has been terminated. And so it'll be up to the practice to then tell VITL, and we'll have a form that the practice can use to tell us that the patient relationship has been either terminated or expired, which would be the more correct.
Would be terminated. And this, you know, we anticipate that this isn't going to happen that often, that we're going to have a lot of situations where you may have a patient who sees you once, you're not quite sure whether they're going to come back or not, but you've got a medical record that's active and accessible, and you never hear from the patient. And so in that instance, you're not necessarily required to do anything. But if it is a situation where you've received notice that the patient is moving, or there are instances where there has been, I'm going to call it the falling out between a practice and a patient, and the practice may have provided the patient notification that they are terminating the relationship. Those would be the times when a termination form would need, should be followed.
And as I said, we'll be supplying all of the participating provider sites with those forms, so that if it does happen, that you'll have a way of transmitting that information to us. I do have a question here. Somebody's kind of thinking ahead, which is always good. What would happen in the situation where VITL does an audit of a practitioner and that consent is missing? What happens?
Well, in that instance, and these are some of the eventualities that we look at as far as the participation agreement, because basically everybody needs to be playing by the same rule, but we may have a situation that in fact is a serious HIPAA breach because there's been an access of information without consent. And so VITL will work with that provider to investigate what was the basis for accessing the information. It may involve talking with the patient depending on whether in fact there was a treatment relationship and there was an implication that there was consent. So these will need to be specifically reviewed between VITL's privacy officer and either the administrator or privacy officer of the specific organization to look at under what circumstances was there access without consent.
Okay, thanks, Ann. So I'm going to just do a little bit of a time check here and say it's about 10 after 1. And we've got a lot of questions, and I don't think that we could even begin to get to all of them today. Or we'd be on here for several more hours. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go about another 5 minutes, and then we're going to cut it off, because I'm sure a lot of you would like to keep listening, but you're probably feeling the tug of having to go back to work. So we'll go another 5 minutes. We'll try to get through a couple more questions, and then we'll call it a day. So a question has come in, and I think this is a really good question. Here at VITL, anybody who's talked to us knows that we really encourage healthcare providers to be using electronic systems, to use health IT. I mean, that's what we're all about. So a question is here about that information about the query result, and can that be pulled into the electronic medical record? And the answer, Don, is yes. You will be able to, in the provider portal, you will be able to, if you've pulled up a patient's record, you will be able to make a file that you can then import or attach to your electronic medical record and make that part of your clinical documentation. So and we'll be training when we go out and we get you started on the provider portal. We'll show you how to do it. We'll show your staffs how to do it. But that will be the case. You will not have to print this stuff out and then scan it back into your electronic record. You'll be able to just save it as a file, and then I'm not sure if it's a PDF file but it's some file that certainly can be added to your electronic record. And you didn't ask this, Don, but I'm also going to say we are also working on making available, maybe not during the pilot stage, but at some point making available a electronic system for patient consent. Some of you out there are using electronic signature pads to capture patient consent, and so we eventually would like to be able to use some type of electronic system. Again, as I said, because we try to encourage as many providers as possible to be using electronic systems in health IT, and we'd like to try to eventually get the patient consent process to be electronic as well. So I'm trying to scan through their list of questions and see if I can pick out one that is something that will be applicable to a lot of you, rather than a kind of a individual question. So here's a question. If a patient has declined to give consent, is their data then blocked by the system? Or do we have to rely on ourselves to know that they've declined?
The information, to my understanding, would not be blocked. That if someone declines to get consent, you don't have consent. And so for a provider to be seeking access to that person, it would need to be for emergency treatment only. So yes, you do have to rely upon yourself and discipline within your own organization that people who are seeking information on the exchange know that there needs to be consent on record or an unusual emergency treatment need.
I would agree with that. I think that the technology may change as we go along, but I think it's just as a practice, just as a policy, you really ought to know before you try to access that information, before you log in, before you try to pull up that patient's information, you ought to know, your provider ought to know if the patient has given consent.
Well, and my understanding is that as you go in, there will be a flag that if there isn't a consent on record, then you would need to, quote, break the glass. And to do that, you'd either have to have just gotten consent or you would need to be able to vouch for an emergency access.
Right. But again, this will be part of the training. We'll go through all of this when we're out at the sites. So I see it's about 1:15, and as I said, I think rather than keeping everybody here, I mean, we could go on and on and on, but what we'll do is we'll wrap it up. And first of all, I want to thank Ann Kramer for her time and coming down here to Montpelier, where I am, and making the trek and sitting down and talking about all this. Really appreciate your time and expertise, Ann. And I also want to thank all of you out there. We had close to 100 people, 100 attendees today, which is a really great turnout. So I appreciate all of your interest and your willingness to spend your lunch hour with us. And I'll just kind of put in that last plug. If you heard this webinar and you think you would like to be considered for a pilot, please send me an email and right there, and the first bullet is my email address, slarose@vitl.net. Send me an email, let me know, put your contact information in there as well. Chances are we have it if you've dealt with VITL before, but just on the off chance we don't have it, it'll make it a little easier for me. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at some pilot sites and then putting all of what we've been talking about today into motion. So it'll be happening fairly quickly here. So with that, again, thank you all, and we really appreciate it. And we'll, for those of you who are pilot sites, we'll be out talking with you fairly soon. And otherwise, we hope you'll continue to follow this. We do have a monthly newsletter that VITL does that you can sign up on our website to receive. It's on any web page on our website in the lower right-hand corner. There's a little icon with a little envelope and a check mark on it, and you can click on that, give us your email address. We'll be doing a newsletter, and I'm sure that this VITL access and the patient consent policy will be a regular topic in the newsletter, and you can kind of follow it along if you're interested. So with that, thanks everybody, and we really appreciate your time listening this afternoon.